So on June 1st, we reopened classes for part-time instruction in classrooms, and I have to say that it's been a very positive experience for many. Clearly, when we started down this road, we were concerned, as were parents and some teachers and some other workers in the sector, that there might be health concerns. We've seen a gradual increase in the number of kids participating. We've seen a sense of relief on the faces of many, many parents who had been struggling, quite frankly, with homeschooling and trying to meet their other basic needs and requirements in the household. So this is good news for the vast majority of British Columbians, and we're confident this can be done in a way that protects the health and safety of teachers, children, and all participants in the K-12 system. We'll have more to say, of course, as the week goes by and into next week, but on balance, we're pretty positive with the outcome at this point, and we're going to keep working to make sure that people are safe and preparing for a full restart come September. The other major change June 1st was, of course, an increase in the minimum wage. The lowest paid workers in British Columbia received a 75-cent an hour pay increase, and that puts us number 2 in the country, behind Alberta, just a little bit ahead of Ontario. I believe that the least paid workers in British Columbia should not pay the brunt of the cost of COVID-19. We had planned for this increase 3 years ago when we put in place a yearly increase to get to $15 an hour by 2021, and with this increase we're on track to achieve that next year. I have heard from some businesses that they're concerned about the increase, but I've also heard from businesses that they have a host of other challenges, and we've been focusing on those, whether it be the cost of rent, whether they be concerned about being evicted from their premises while they're doing their business, and a range of other issues. So I understand that for some, the minimum wage is a challenge, but I know for many who are paid the least in the province, this is a welcome pay increase at a time when they desperately need it. Lastly, I want to just touch upon the violence and the protests that we've seen in the United States over the past number of days. Like you, I'm horrified to see what happened to George Floyd. I'm horrified when I see the response in major U.S. cities. And what I do know is that although we do our level best to address racism here in British Columbia, it exists here as well. And although we do our best to make sure that law enforcement treats everyone equally, we have blemishes on our record as well. But what we do in those situations is try and get better. We can always improve on what we do, whether it be giving police better tools to better understand how to interact with people from different backgrounds. We've had certainly challenges with racism going back to the head tax for Chinese Canadians, the Komagata Maru when it comes to South Asians. Indigenous peoples have experienced racism from the beginning of settlement here in British Columbia. It's imperative that all of us stand together. That's why we reinstated the Human Rights Commission, so that there was a place where people could go to ensure there was justice when injustice is found in the community. That's why we put more money into anti-racism programs, to make sure that we have the tools to arm all citizens with what they need to push back when they see racism. On balance, I believe we're doing well, but we've always got room for improvement. When we look to the south, it causes me great sadness, and I know the vast majority of Canadians feel the same way. But in British Columbia, we have a history of peaceful demonstration. We had a demonstration here in the legislature to add to the voices around the world calling on the United States to do better. It was peaceful, it was appropriate, and I encourage people to have their voices be heard, but also please, please, abide by the directions that Dr. Henry has put in place. Try and stay a good distance away from your fellow protesters. Wear a mask if at all possible. If you're going to be chanting, by all means, make sure you're covering yourself up so you're not potentially infecting other people.
Good day, Premier. The headline in the Victoria paper on Saturday was Cruise Ship Season on the Rocks. 300 ships, 750,000 visitors, and more than $100 million local economic impact. You've talked several times about a tourism strategy that's coming from the government, and I'm wondering when we might see that, and can you give any indication of what the response is going to be for the provincial capital region, which is very hard hit by there not being a cruise ship season this year?
Thank you, Vaughn, for the question. And of course, cruise ships are just one component of what has been historically a very dynamic international tourism marketplace, not just here on the South Island, but indeed right across British Columbia. So the closing of borders, the restriction of international travel until the 22nd of June was a major challenge, or is a major challenge for many tourism operators. With respect to the cruise ship sector, those vessels that would have been landing in Victoria or Vancouver, up the North Island and on to Prince Rupert, I think the market will decide what the future of the cruise ship industry is in British Columbia and Alaska. You will know, Vaughn, that as we've gone through this slowdown in the economy and as we all around the world try to manage the impacts of COVID-19, we've seen many outbreaks on cruise ships. I think that the industry's taken a bit of a black eye through this period, and I don't know how many people are lining up to get on cruise ships in the first place. I know I had a friend who works on a cruise ship, and she was floating around in the South Pacific for a month and a half with no port to land in. So there are issues to be resolved on the cruise ship side. But your point is, what are we going to do to backfill for those many hundreds of thousands of travelers who have come to British Columbia year after year to enjoy the many attractions, the many opportunities, whether they be ecotourism opportunities or mainstays like the Butchart Gardens here in Victoria. It's going to be a challenging period. Business understands that. We've been working with the federal government to make sure that our border issues are consistent with the need for public health, but also looking to things like family reunification as the beginning of the softening of the border as we see positive numbers with respect to new cases, only 4 yesterday. That's not to say we're going to continue to have single-digit numbers. That's going to change and go up and down in the days and weeks ahead. But the data looks promising, and so we're reaching out to providers. Minister Lisa Baer has been holding stakeholder conversations regularly for the past month and a half, and we've been pushing all of that information back to the federal government so that we can have a response that helps sustain many of the businesses that have been the foundation of our tourism economy for decades.
Our next question is from Binder Sajan.
Hi, Premier. Just on that tourism note, the Liberals have suggested easing restrictions by regions that have lower case counts, saying that could potentially help tourism if you allow people within those regions to move around. Wondering what you think about that idea.
Well, Dr. Henry's been pretty clear on that, not just this recent overture, but over the past month or so, there has been a lot of talk about why don't you have a regional approach, and she's been pretty categorical that the virus is everywhere in British Columbia. There is not one part of the province that is less susceptible to outbreak if we don't follow the directions that have been laid out by public health officials. And we have opened up our campsites June the 1st. There are people camping. They're going to see more and more travel throughout the summer as we get towards phase 3. And we'll see tourism, domestic tourism, I think, pick up and in fact break records as British Columbians stay home and enjoy the beauty and the splendors of every corner of the province. International travel is going to be a challenge, and we need to get our heads around that. Industry needs to get their heads around that, and having different rules in the north or on the island or in the Kootenays is not going to change the fact that cruise ships aren't going to be landing in British Columbia until at least October. It's not going to change the fact that international travel restrictions are going to keep people away from British Columbia, whether it's the north, the Kootenays, or the island. So a regional strategy just doesn't work when it comes to international tourism. And as for domestic tourism, we're going to do everything we can with an aggressive promotion campaign in the days ahead to encourage people to visit every part of BC if they've got the time to do so.
Next, we have a question from Rob Buffum.
Well, hi, Premier. Thanks for your time. I guess sort of sticking with the theme of tourism, I'm wondering about most specifically when we can expect to hear British Columbians are encouraged to do those trips within the province, whether it's to Tofino or the Okanagan. I know that's, if I understand correctly, part of phase 3. When will that be? In a week or two? Would you encourage people to go travel around the province?
Well, I would, if people want to book arrangements at their favorite place in BC, you certainly can do that now. but there's no guarantee you'll be able to get there. We need to follow this very closely. We have had success in BC because people have done this together. And although I absolutely understand that people are going to want to go and move around, and I absolutely understand that tourism operators want to see that happen, but it wasn't that long ago that leaders in tourism-dependent communities were saying stay home. So we can't lose sight of the road we've traveled. We've all worked really hard to get here, and we can't just flick a switch and get back to normal. It has to be gradual. We have a plan. We expect that the incubation period from phase 1 is into its second incubation period. The numbers have been very low. I would expect in the middle of June we're going to be looking at further easing of restrictions and starting into phase 3 or stage 3 of the restart. But I don't want to give people false hope. Anything can happen. This is a dynamic virus that has affected different parts of the world differently, and we're in good shape today because of the collective efforts of British Columbians. They need to hold the course until we can safely say it's time to move around.
The next question is from Lisa Yuzda.
Hi, Premier. Speaking about schools, you talked about saying that schools are returning and it's going well and this is ready, preparing for a full start in the fall. But we've heard Minister Fleming and Dr. Henry say that what we're going to see in the fall is some kind of hybrid of at-home learning and at-school learning. Minister Fleming saying that they'll be taking where the successes some teachers have had with remote learning and share it with all teachers. But this is filling a lot of parents with anxiety, wondering how this is going to happen, what they're going to do with their jobs in the fall if kids are not there full time. How are you going to teach these teachers how to work this new way if they're already in school teaching right now and then on their summer break? People just wondering how this is all going to work.
Well, it's going to work the way we've got the relaunch as of Monday, with a lot of cooperation, a lot of hard work by all of the various component parts, whether it be teachers, support workers, with QP, superintendents, principals, vice principals, trustees, and of course parents. And parents have been holding up the sky for the past month and a half, and I can well imagine they're anxious to pass their kids back to the public education system here in British Columbia. We want that to happen, and we want to make sure we're doing it in a way that's safe for all participants and will get the best benefit for the kids, of course, which is the center of our learning experiences at K-12. But we need to figure out how we're going to do that, and we don't have an answer today. That's why Rob Fleming, the minister, has been working with all of the people involved to try and find a way forward. I'll leave it to him to give more information as we have it, but we're on day 3 now. We've seen an increase in kids coming. We've seen an increase in enthusiasm on their faces, and also, I have to say, on many, many teachers who love being in their classroom with their kids. Will there be changes come September? That's the point of having a slow restart right now. We'll be able to inform parents throughout the summer, which is not atypical for the K-12 year. You find out just before Labor Day what's going on, or just after Labor Day. That's the way it's always been. I suspect that's the way it will always be.
Next, we have a question from Tanya Fletcher.
Hi, Premier. Laid-off hospitality workers are calling on the province and the feds to make sure their employers don't use the pandemic as an opportunity to replace them with workers with more seniority. Is there anything the province can do to improve the job security of these workers in the hotel industry, especially when it could take years for the industry as a whole to fully recover?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Tanya. Those are big challenges. We fortified our employment standards provisions in the one-day session we had with a full cooperation of both opposition parties last month or 2 months ago now, and we're coming into the legislature in the weeks ahead, and if there's a requirement to change employment standards, we'll certainly do that. But we're calling on employers to do the right thing and make sure that they're keeping their workforce intact to the greatest extent possible. We expect that to happen. If we need to take steps using the legislature to protect workers, we'll do that. But our concern is right now, how do we get businesses back and running? That involves absolutely confident consumers. We need all British Columbians to feel comfortable going back into whatever the business might be, whether it's travel, staying in a hotel, whether it's going to a restaurant. And I know that people are excited about going to restaurants and having someone else do the cooking and doing the dishwashing. I know that's what I'm hearing from my spouse. And so I think the challenges are obvious, but our focus is on trying to find a way to collaborate with employers, with employees. That's why our Economic Recovery Task Force includes labor, small businesses, large businesses, because everyone at the table is what's led to our success to this point. We need to keep that attitude going through the restart.
Next, we have a question from Rob Shaw.
Oh, hey, Premier. I just want to build off Lisa's question earlier. If we're headed to a hybrid model in school in September, and parents aren't going to know how many days their kids are actually in school until close to Labor Day, as you said, how is the child care issue going to work in your mind? You've mentioned in the past you aren't considering accelerating $10 a day child care programs. So is there anything you can do or are planning on doing to open up some more spaces if people are going to have their kids in part-time childcare in September and are probably going to spend the summer worrying about that?
Well, we were operating $10 a day pilots prior to COVID-19, and I don't want to reimagine my comments to you a few weeks ago, Rob, but we're not backing away from childcare, period. We are trying to find the best way to deliver those services in a cost-effective manner at a time when revenues have fallen to governments, family income is declining. We need to rebuild with a focus on providing quality childcare, and we're going to we are still committed to doing that. My response was specifically to $10 a day, but if we've learned anything over the past 2.5 months, it's the importance of childcare to our economy. If there were any people out there that doubted this being an economic policy, not just a social policy, we've had that evidence over the past 2.5 months. And your question also just puts it squarely in front of people. We need childcare to get back into the economy. So with respect to how the K-12 system feeds into that, we will have over the summer the opportunity to look at how we can have in-class learning for students in the K-12 system, and also childcare at schools, because we have the infrastructure there. We need the early childhood educators to get those diplomas and certificates in place so that we can expand the program. This had been, as you know, a 10-year plan, and we can't accelerate 10 years of work into 10 months, but we can redouble our efforts to make sure that quality, affordable, accessible childcare is there for all British Columbians in every corner of the province, and we're committed to that.
Next, we have a question from Mary Griffin.
Hello, hi, Premier. Thanks so much for taking my call. First off, I just have a two-parter, a question for my colleague in Nanaimo. She wanted me to ask you about the fact that playgrounds are reopening around the province. And do you have a message of reassurance for parents who want to bring their children there? They want to push them on the swings, but are hesitant or might be a bit worried now that the tape has come down from the playgrounds. And also the fact that second, the Fraser Institute says we could enjoy a 4-day work week, but not for a decade, and only if we are more productive, so we work harder.
Was that it, Mary? Okay, well, let me start with the Fraser Institute report. Rare is the day that I crack the cover of a Fraser Institute report, but I am intrigued about the idea of a 4-day work week, and I'll certainly take a look at that. But 10 years from now, that will be the middle of my 4th term, and I'll be looking for a 1-day work week by that point, I'm pretty sure of it. So it's a bit into the future, and I don't want to discourage the Fraser Institute or anyone else from bringing forward good ideas. One of the advantages and opportunities we have coming out of a pandemic is nothing should be off the table. And I meant no disrespect to the Fraser Institute in my response. Anyone out there who has an idea, we want to hear about it. We'll be expanding our recovery plan after that helicopter lands. We'll be expanding our recovery plan in the weeks ahead, and we'll have more to say about that either at this podium or elsewhere. But we need new ideas, good ideas, and we should be unafraid to have those discussions. So again, I say without any hesitation, if the Fraser Institute has good ideas, they want to bring them forward, I look forward to that. With respect to kids going back to playgrounds, again, it's another one of those things where you can just see, you can imagine the joy on youngsters' faces to be able to go back to the park that they used to go with their parents or their guardians or their older siblings to play and laugh and enjoy a sunny summer day. And I encourage all parents to do that, but also to be mindful of physical distancing. Try and keep your loved ones, your little ones, a good distance away from other kids in the playground. Take along some wipes with you if you can. Wouldn't hurt to wipe things off before you use them. And I encourage people to enjoy all of the amenities in our parks, whether they be municipal parks, provincial parks, or federal parks.
Now we have a question from Cindy Harnett.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking my question. You mentioned earlier a regional approach amid the pandemic won't work in tourism. Where, if anywhere, will a regional approach work? And that's in the context of Vancouver Island, where we still only have one case. And if I may, just going off Rob's question about childcare, might you be encouraging employers to allow people to work from home if in September older children are having to do some degree of online schooling?
Well, thank you for the question. Certainly, employers are free to find the best way to maximize the benefit of their employee to their business. We've seen successful transitions from a workplace to working from home over the past 2.5 months. That's not going to work for all businesses, but if it works for some, I encourage that. The idea, of course, is more productivity, safer workplace. All of those things can be accommodated by having flexibility. And I think what I've heard more than anything else from employers is they're reimagining their future, just as governments are reimagining how we operate. Families are trying to figure out what all of this means. What's the school year going to look like? How are we going to manage childcare? How are we going to deal with mom and dad? They're getting a little bit older. Are we confident in long-term care? We should be in British Columbia, but we hear stories across the country that give us concern. So these are opportunities for us to engage and talk about what we want to see in our homes, in our communities, in our workplaces, and indeed right across the country. And the unprecedented collaboration has really been helpful in that regard. And so I don't want to immediately dismiss the Liberal idea of having regional reopenings, but we have a plan that involves reopening every corner of the province. Stage 2 is underway. Stage 3 is just around the corner. And whether you live on the North Coast or on Vancouver Island or in the Kootenays, we all want to come out of this together, safe and focused on a bright future for all British Columbians. And I believe the direction that we've been given by Dr. Henry and Cabinet has confirmed is the best way forward. We are all in this together, north, south, east, and west, and the best way forward is that we take these steps together.
Next, we have a question from Keith Baldry.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for this. Just want to ask you about your weekly call with the Prime Minister and Premiers. What are your priorities going into this one? Do they remain sick leave provisions, long-term care, border concerns, and if those are the issues, are you satisfied with the progress being made on them?
Thanks for that. There are two issues that I've been focusing on the past couple of weeks. One is transit funding. To make sure that we have for TransLink and BC Transit operating funds that can sustain those operations. Municipalities who participate in operating funds are challenged right now, as the provincial government as well as the federal government. So when the Prime Minister announced on Monday a package of resources for municipalities, that was with the view of allowing us to work with municipalities to find ways to fund transit. So that's a checked box as far as I'm concerned. There's details to work out for sure, and it's likely that Doug Ford, who's also been on this with me, and I and the Prime Minister will engage with it tomorrow. When it comes to the paid sick leave, we've made great progress there, and the details are yet to be worked out. But I go back to how we've approached this federal-provincial interaction going back to the end of February, the beginning of March. And the level of collaboration has been unprecedented. I think for those who've watched federal-provincial relations over the decades, there's no comparable experience to what we're going through right now. And the highlight for me has been the flexibility of the federal government. They're prepared to listen to the provinces about the best way to deliver services and programs, which is what we do. And without saying just send the cash, which has historically been the position of the provinces. Instead, we're saying these are the objectives we want to realize in provincial capitals across the country. How does the federal government engage in that, participate in that equally so that it benefits everyone across the country? So the sick pay issue is well in hand, I believe. We'll have details to follow. And on the transit side, I think the municipality funding will help us immensely in that regard. What I'm going to be focusing on coming into this week are issues that are pretty mundane. The Columbia River Treaty is up for renegotiation. We're a component part of that with the federal government. So that's not of much interest to the people of Alberta or New Brunswick, but it's critically important to the people in the Kootenays and in British Columbia. And also a whole range of other issues that I think are top of mind now, and that is anti-racism. We are pretty clear in British Columbia that, again, we are wanting to push as hard as we can for national approaches to these vexing problems. We have enough to deal with here in British Columbia by ourselves, but if we are aided by a federal program and a federal initiative that has us all working together from coast to coast to coast, I think that lifts up all Canadians, and we can identify and recognize that as a diverse, multicultural country, better to have a national approach to these issues and having provinces fully supporting those. And those are some of the things we'll talk about this week.
I have a question about, and I guess we're expecting some more bleak unemployment statistics out later this week. There's an issue on Vancouver Island with Mosaic Forest Management. They've curtailed their operations since last fall. Now they're saying they won't put 2,000 coastal forest workers back to work unless they get more freedom to sell raw logs. I know it's a federal issue, but I'm wondering if you have any advice or wishes about how the federal government will handle this.
Thank you, Justine. And I've met with Mosaic last year in the fall. I've met with them again at the turn of the new year. And I understand their challenges, but and the bulk of their activity is on private managed land. I think people don't, if they don't understand that, there's a big block in the middle of Vancouver Island that was given away for a railway that no longer runs to a coal baron who's long dead. But nonetheless, what was historically Crown land, in fact, what was historically Indigenous land, is private land now, and the rules of logging on those lands are largely governed by the federal government. And so the Mosaic's beef is with the federal government, but I support the notion of ensuring that we keep as many logs here in British Columbia as possible, creating more jobs and more wealth for British Columbians. I appreciate that Mosaic has a whole host of markets that they need to satisfy, but I've heard from scores of small remanufacturing companies that are anxious to get access to those logs. The challenge is at what price? And so these are market-based decisions. We have to manage, of course, the public lands in the public interest. Mosaic has different people to respond to than I do, and I have some sympathy for their position, but I want to make sure that we keep as many logs in British Columbia, providing as many jobs as are possible, and I think that's the majority view of British Columbians, regardless of where you live or how you vote.
We have two more questions. That's all the time we have, but the first of the last two goes to Tom Fletcher.
Hi, Premier. Also related to Indigenous land, I've been speaking with ranchers and lodge owners, west of Williams Lake, who say that they are losing access to their own properties and Crown grazing land as a result of the Silcotin title transfer. They are comparing it to the Wet'suwet'en talks where federal and provincial discussions have left them out. Any advice for them?
Well, I have seen correspondence from landowners in the Chilcotin. I understand their issues. We're raising those with Ministry of Indigenous Relations. Scott Fraser, the minister's seized of all of this. Doug Donaldson, responsible for forest lands and natural resource operations and rural development, also aware of it. But there are court decisions that are in place that make certain the Silcotin have jurisdiction over a specific map as well as other traditional territories, and we're working through that. We want to make sure we do that in the best interest of everybody, the Silcotin, local landowners, and of course the broader community.
And our last question is from Richard Zisman today.
Thank you for taking my question. Premier, are you worried that businesses boarding themselves up in Vancouver in preparation for what's expected to be a peaceful rally on Friday could incite looting. And can you explain to people what the difference is between a protest that has more than 50 people, which is against the provincial order, than a wedding that may have more than 50 people? People are confused about why the province is saying you can continue protesting but keep your physical distance, while not saying you can have a wedding and keep your physical distance.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Firstly, with respect to businesses taking actions to protect their property, I'll leave that to them. I'm absolutely hopeful that any of the demonstrations that are supporting the issues of Black Lives Matter and other issues of racism in British Columbia and around the world will be peaceful and will be focused on the issue at hand. If there are those that try and insert themselves within what will be by and large, and has been by and large, peaceful protest, of course, that's where we need to take action. Law enforcement will be prepared to do that. But I can't counsel businesses on what to do. I can say to British Columbians, I have every expectation, as they do, that if we want to have our voices heard, we need to do it in a peaceful manner, which has been a long-standing tradition in British Columbia. With respect to protests versus official gatherings, again, if people congregate to have their voices heard in a random way, which is, although we do have notice that it's happening, it's not a scheduled event as a wedding would be, or as a drive-in theater would be, or any other areas where public health orders are in place. And free association and the ability to speak about issues that matter in the public square is a fundamental right. I've talked to Dr. Henry about this and Minister Dix. It's a challenge. I absolutely understand how the public will go, what's the difference? But there's a big difference. We're saying to people, let's have smaller events. If you're celebrating matrimony, you're getting married, try and do it under 50 people. Try and exercise responsibility. I'm saying the same thing to protesters. Please do the right thing, be responsible to yourself, and more importantly, to the people around you. I think we'll all get out of this stronger than we did coming in, but I do understand the motivation and the desire for people to have their voices heard at this most extraordinary time in our world history.